So we began a series last week, a teaching series that I told you we've been working on for a long time. And by working on, I mean mostly praying over for a very long time. And the way I worded it last week is that God has kind of had it marinating for us for a time. We thought we'd introduce it earlier last year, and then that got bumped ahead, and then it got bumped from the fall, and it just kept getting moved until we got to the right place, we feel, really where God has given us the freedom to walk into this series. And it's a series that has a lot to do with areas that you don't often hear about in church, and specifically mental health and then in a general way, kind of how that our mental health affects the rest of us. And so we began last week with kind of an introductory message in the series, and this morning we're going to be hearing from a different voice. Now, appreciate that many of you will know Giselle Tranquilla, who's our worship leader here. You'll know her as a worship leader. What you might not know about Giselle is that she actually also has, her main gig is that she is a trained family and individual counselor. She has a practice in the city, and it's a very busy practice. And so when Giselle and I meet to talk about things, we often go to talking about clinical kinds of issues. And so when we were going to do this series, realizing that, I am not a material expert in a lot of these areas, we thought we wanted to hear some different voices. Giselle's one of those that we wanted to hear from. So this morning we're going to be talking a little bit about depression and anxiety, specifically those things. And we're looking forward to it. We're going to do it interview style. That's why there's not a pulpit on the stage. There's a couple of chairs on the stage. And looking forward to that. But just before I invite her to come up on the stage with me, I want to just show you the verse that we talked about last week to keep this at the front of our mind, okay? In John's Gospel in chapter 10, it's a time when Jesus is talking to his disciples about how much he loves and wants to care for his sheep, essentially. He calls himself the Good Shepherd. And when he talks about that, he uses this imagery of bringing his sheep into a sheepfold, into a place where they'd be safe at night. But that how sometimes, in a broken world, thieves and robbers will sneak in over the walls that intend to bring death and intend to bring harm and intend to steal and rob us of our joy and all of those kinds of things. And thieves and robbers can take the form of a lot of different things, some of which we're talking about in our series. But that is not God's desire for any of us. It's not God's desire for you. God's desire is something entirely different. And so as we throw this verse up, I wonder if you'll read it aloud with me, okay? It's from John 10:10. Jesus said, "My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life." We want to keep that at the front of our series, that God's desire for each of us, his purpose, is to give us a rich and satisfying life. That's what his desire is for us. And so we're leaning into that richness and that satisfaction. We're leaning into that throughout our series. So I'm going to invite Giselle to come up, and we'll take our place here on the stage. Thanks very much. Oh, I'm going to get my water too. Hang on. So, welcome, Giselle.
This feels weird.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're used to being kind of in behind the piano there. Welcome to my perspective, my vantage point a little bit more.
You all look great, by the way.
Yeah. And, Giselle, I mentioned that Giselle and I meet. And by the way, just if you're interested in knowing this, we have a weekly meeting to kind of prepare and plan for our services, and we meet in the food court at the Regent Mall. That's where we meet. And so we're there every Tuesday at 9:30. If you're walking through the mall for any reason and you want to stop by and say hi, feel free. Come on in by and say hi to us. But we're typically there on Tuesday morning just talking about these things. And while we talk, often we talk about some of these kinds of issues. We get sidetracked on it. And so when this series came up, it's like, well, this is ideal for us. We're going to have a Regent Mall food court meeting right here in front of our church family, if that's okay.
Much cozier here.
Yeah, right. And so I wanted to just begin by saying, again, I've pointed it out already, Giselle, that a lot of people here will know you as a worship leader, and that's your passion. We see that every. But what most people don't get a chance to see is the other part of your way you serve people and want to help people. And so maybe could you just tell us a little bit, because again, most people don't know this, just how your journey led you to that area of family and individual counseling, just how life took you that direction.
I feel like there's an element of blessing to this, because not everybody probably has this sort of experience in their journey, in their walk, even just in terms of figuring out what they're going to do with their life. But God made it pretty clear to me really early on in my life that helping people, working with people would be what he had for me to do. And again, before I was done, even with public school, grade 12, I knew that was going to be in the area of counseling. So he led me pretty directly to Crandall University, where I started that journey, learning in the context of a faith community, which I think, for me anyway, was hugely important, because the area of psychology has lots of room to take you way off base. Mm-hmm. So having my learning rooted in faith was pretty important. And then he led me to a grad school out in British Columbia with the same focus. It was at another Christian university. That wasn't necessarily what I would say I planned to do, but that's where he led me, and I had some phenomenal experiences out there in my learning journey. And then, yeah, he's opened some kind of, I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but he opened some pretty awesome doors and then brought me home to continue working here.
Yeah, great. So I'll jump right in then. We seem to hear a lot more. It's part of the reason behind this series. We're hearing a lot more about mental health related issues these days. And I'm just curious, when you began that educational journey, did you think that the things that you're doing now did you think then that the things you're doing now would be in place? Or like as mental health, is it something that's more of an issue now, like mental health, people who are dealing with mental health issues? Is that more of an issue now, or has that always been there and we're just becoming maybe more aware?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how God continues to formulate things or to sort of shape you in different ways. So am I doing what I thought I would do? Not necessarily, and then on the other hand, there's definitely elements that I knew what it would look like, but I think I've learned, if nothing else, I have to just stay open to however God's going to shape things. Good question around, are we seeing more? Is it getting worse? I think sometimes the analogy that I talk about, I'm a word picture person, so it's kind of like when I bought my car and I kind of thought, oh, that's an interesting shade of blue, and I don't really think I see that around, and then I start driving my car around and I'm like, did everybody else go out and buy the same car? Because,
right.
No, they were there all along, right? I'm just seeing them. So I think as we learn more about things like mental health issues, we're gonna see them differently. We're gonna understand them differently. It doesn't mean that everybody is diagnosable, but I think just it's important to be learning more and more about kind of not only where our struggle points are, but better and better tools for how to navigate through them. And I think again, the beautiful thing that I get to do is I get to do that in the context of where I know the ultimate anchor is, the source of hope is, and that's a dangerous word sometimes to use these days, but with God at the center of that learning and that understanding, it just opens doors, I think.
Yeah, good. So I appreciate that you just mentioned that. You bring that to the table in a sense that you have this relationship with Jesus. You can't not have that. You can't not bring that into every place that you are, even if it's not overtly stated, right? But if we could just think theologically about this whole issue for a minute, because that's really what we can add as a church maybe to the conversation, the broader conversations being had. As Christians, we read passages in the Bible, such as Philippians 4:6, where it says, be anxious for nothing. That's the old language, right? Or don't worry about anything. That's what the Bible says. So we read that, Paul's words, and I don't know, I wonder if people feel unnecessarily guilty when they read those kinds of words. Like, can Christians actually get depressed? And if so, if Christians can get depressed, like, does it mean that that's a problem, like we're out of balance somehow spiritually or something along those lines, that we've maybe departed from the presence of God in any way?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the significant kind of myths or stigmas that gets attached to mental health issues in general, but for sure, maybe in a different way within faith context and within church context, that there's almost this shame attached to, like, okay, but if I do feel this way, then what's wrong with me, or what am I doing wrong? And I need to come back to, or I want to come back to, and it's been said a few times already this morning, we live in a broken world. We live in brokenness in this world, and that impacts each of us as believers, as those who are searching, whatever. It affects all of us. So is it possible for Christians who are on track in their journey with the Lord, who are experiencing God moving in their lives, who are aware and tuned in, is it possible for us to experience anxiety and depression? Absolutely. Because it's part of brokenness. Yeah. And I think it actually is one of the biggest tools that the enemy is using these days to break down not only individuals, but families, churches. I think we have to be aware of that.
Yeah. So as I reflect theologically, I think that in the Bible, when you start to look at the Bible through a different lens, that you can see that sometimes there are probably several instances in the Bible where you see people who are dealing with mental health crises. So I'm thinking of Elijah, who had a great victory, but then he went into a significant depression, and as a result of that, isolated himself from all kinds of people, which probably wasn't the best thing to do, but that was Elijah. I'm thinking of Jonah, who struggled with doing what God wanted him to do, and he ended up in a very dark place where he could hardly stand to be with himself, essentially. I'm thinking of Jeremiah, who we call the weeping prophet, and Jeremiah actually, as he was trying to fulfill God's will in his life, actually asked God at one point to take him from it. And so he was having some of those kinds of tendencies that we hear talked about in our world. I guess, can you tell us a little bit, appreciating that you say we can all be affected because we live in this broken world, can you tell us a little bit about what is going on inside a person who is struggling with anxiety or depression? If you can just break that down a bit for us, that would be helpful.
So I'm going to try to do a nutshell version of what I call my very oversimplified brain science lesson on anxiety. I need a better title, but the way that I sort of learn and understand is I need to know how something works in order to better understand it, obviously, and then also to figure out how to deal with it, how to apply tools and strategies. So I talk a lot about the brain because it's where most of what we experience is centered and based. I mean, it's all connected, but we can't talk about anxiety and depression without talking about the brain. So there are functions in the brain that our amazing creator designed to be part of our experience, including, believe it or not, to some extent, the experience of anxiety and depression. And again, this isn't about diagnosing everybody with a disorder. That's a different thing. This is just talking about the experience of it, right? The function of anxiety in us actually has two really positive purposes. It helps keep us alive, number one. Number two, and I'll get into that in a minute. Number two, it actually helps us accomplish goals. We need the adrenaline boost that happens when we have to, maybe get up and talk in front of people or whatever the task is that we have to do. We need some of the response that happens in the brain that is connected with anxiety to help us accomplish those goals. So there's positive parts to it. But the issue comes in, and this is where the brokenness impacts us, is that we have problems when that starts to get out of balance. When the brain and its responses start happening when we don't really need them, or it kind of gets a little bit stuck, and we can't just, correct it immediately. So we have to do some intentional things. But here's what's going on really, really basically. The example that I usually talk about with anyone who meets with me is if you imagine a moment, a situation, hopefully this doesn't trigger anybody because we live in a world with bears, but if you imagine a moment where you encounter a bear, you see the bear in your backyard, right? They live here in Rusagonis, in case people didn't know. But that moment where you encounter the bear, that bear becomes sort of symbolic of all sorts of things that can set off this response in our brain. In the brain, there's an area called the amygdala. Whoever named these things, but the amygdala is sort of like our fear interpretation center in our brain. I like to think of it as the 911 response center, dispatch center for the brain. When that thing that we sort of identify as a threat of some kind is identified, the amygdala essentially starts to put the brain in sort of an autopilot kind of state where certain things are going to kick in and happen automatically. We don't have to think about them. It's the survival instinct, right? And the brain does that through three main mechanisms. Probably heard them. It's the fight, flight, or freeze response. One of those three. There's some argument that one or two additional versions might happen, but those are the three basics. And you're not going to have to pick which one is going to happen. The brain it's in that autopilot. And in order for us to get ready for any of those three things, there are a lot of stuff that has to start changing in our bodies. Our large muscle groups need to get ready for action. In order to do what they need to do, they need more oxygen. So our breathing changes. We start breathing more shallow, more rapid. In order for the oxygen to get to those large muscle groups, travels through our bloodstream. So our heart rate goes up, starts pounding faster and harder. That's the great designer had a purpose in all of this, right? That helps keep us alive. It helps get the job done. what starts to become problematic, there's sort of three things that I see as big complications to that system doing what it's supposed to do. Because what it's supposed to do is when the threat is gone, that autopilot, the brain knows how to shut down that autopilot. And we go back to sort of our normal state, whatever normal is these days. But what happens is, if that system starts responding to things for too long, or too many things start setting off that response in the brain, then it can kind of start getting stuck, right? And it's not just a life-threatening thing that will set off that response in the brain. The first complication is that anything that makes us feel anxious or fearful or that we worry about, any of those things set off the same response in the brain as if we were in a life-threatening situation. That doesn't make sense logically. There's very little about it that's logical, but that's what the brain's doing. So for some of us, that can include things like having to make a phone call, right? We know that making a phone call is not going to be a danger to us, but the brain starts responding as if it might, right? And then it starts creating a list of additional things that it's now going to have this response to, having to go to the grocery store, having to be in a room full of people mingling and doing social things, you know? And these may sound like they're silly to some of us, but they're not when this is what's going on in the brain, right? And when the brain is set off in those ways too often and for long enough periods of time, it gets a little bit stuck and the brain forgets how to shut off the autopilot. So what you have is, because all of that communicating that's going on up here, starting with the amygdala, is happening through our chemical system. Again, the great designer, everything has a purpose. And when that system is triggered, we start overproducing chemicals like adrenaline. We've all heard of that. We start overproducing cortisol, they are two of our main stress hormones that we naturally produce. They start being overproduced. Well, if that system is stuck, then we also now have a system that is being overloaded with chemicals that don't have a job to do. They keep us in a state of readiness, of alertness. So what happens over time is, if our sort of normal, again, I don't like using that word these days, but if our baseline for experiencing anxiety, for example, is sort of down here, we have room to deal with everyday stuff, or maybe even some big stuff, without feeling like it's going to tip us over the edge. Right. But what happens when that system is stuck on is the brain all by itself, because it adapts amazingly, it starts to move where normal is. It starts to move our baseline to the point where even maybe it's stuck up here and we don't have a lot of headroom for dealing with the everyday regular stuff, let alone maybe the big stuff. And everything now has the potential to tip us over the edge, right? To experience sometimes even debilitating anxiety. We also like to use sort of more comfortable words as adults, especially when we're talking about anxiety. We like to use words like stress, overwhelmed. They're all connected to the same function in the brain. Again, this is why it's not about diagnosing anyone. It's just recognizing what is going on.
Right.
There's a third thing that complicates all of this, and I know I'm saying a lot, but hopefully it's enough just to kind of tantalize you to keep chewing on it. The brain does this amazing thing, and again, the Lord designed this, so there's a purpose for it. When required, when that function is really actually keeping us alive, the brain will decide that it needs to put as much energy as possible into that survival response, right? That makes sense. We got to stay alive first before we can do anything else.
Right.
To the point where it will start shutting down some of the other functions in the brain. So an example of that would be if any of you as parents had a little one, or even if you experienced this yourself, who at the beginning of maybe at least every Monday morning comes to you and says, my tummy hurts, I don't feel good, I'm going to be sick, and you're pretty sure they're not. One of the functions in the brain that is actually told to go to sleep, and we can see this now through brain scans, so there's some hard science being attached to it. But one of the functions that's told to go to sleep is the entire digestive system. So of course they're feeling sick, when realistically what they're experiencing is anxiety, right? We can deal with that a lot differently than, a physical ailment that's actually not because of illness, right? But there's another area in the brain that gets told to go to sleep, essentially, and that is really the main thinking, logical, rational center in the brain that handles really basic problem solving, really simple decision making,
Right.
short-term memory, and what's called new information processing. So, you have the experience where you recognize you're hungry and you go to the refrigerator and you stand in front of the refrigerator for 15 minutes. It's full, there's lots there, and you can't decide what to eat. That's an example of what it can be like to have that sort of almost paralyzing experience with anxiety, because it's telling that really simple decision-making center in the brain not to do its job.
So everything seems harder.
Yeah.
Everything seems harder.
Again, to the point where for some, it's actually incredibly debilitating.
Right.
If you feel like you're reading something, whether it's a text or a book, for fun, for work, whatever, if you're reading it and you feel like you had to read it 5 times and you still don't totally know, you can read,
Right.
but you can't grasp what it is that it's trying to say, that's information processing. That's not happening if that part of the brain is being told to go to sleep.
Right.
And if it's being told to go to sleep most of the time, then those simple functions become complicated, right? The brain is amazing in that it will overcompensate for all of that,
Yeah.
right? But not without a cost.
So Giselle, can you connect us, because that's a lot, folks,
Yeah.
right? That's a lot. But it's why I've got her here and I'm not talking, right? That's good. But can you connect us then just briefly, and I know just to the whole idea of depression specifically. So we learned about anxiety, everything becomes harder. Why does it take some people to that place where they become incapacitated in a way? How depression can kind of limit our ability to live life normally?
Yeah, and I think there's an important piece in there, and that is that whether we're talking anxiety or depression, these are not choices that we're making. It's not as simple as that, right? So therefore, the solutions can't be quite that simple. I mean, some of them, they start there, but depression, it also has a chemical base to it. And I mean, again, not talking about diagnosable clinical depression necessarily, but that experience where you're lowest of the lows, you're having a hard time getting basics taken care of.
Right.
Chemically, we have, again, a brain that's telling certain functions to underproduce some of our chemicals. Again, it's just trying to take care of basics, but it does it in a really unhelpful way a lot of the time. And again, the problem comes in when we get stuck there, right? When the brain gets stuck there.
Which leads to fatigue, isolation, all of those things, right? That we sometimes associate with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Including no energy, including lack of interest in things that you typically would be interested in. Like just not being able to force yourself to just do it.
Right. So I love that this is how the body's responding. It's I think Giselle's been very clear in saying this is, for somebody who's dealing with these kinds of things, it's not something that they've invited. It's an uninvited guest in their life in many ways. So I think of Romans 8 where Paul says that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And so we want to be able to take a lot of the shame away from those feelings that people have and the reaction, the response that they have to what's going on in their life in that way, especially as they think about it from the perspective as a believer. So I got one more question for you, and it has to do with it's kind of a takeaway for us as a church family, as a Christian community. But really, if we can think about those who are dealing with an abundance of anxiety or dealing with depression specifically, like, what does that look like? Because I assume that there are people that are walking among us that are dealing with all kinds of issues that we're just not aware of very much. And so what are some best practices around that? What does it look like? And then what are some best practices around how do we respond to people who are dealing with these kinds of issues? I think it's important for us to hear.
Absolutely. I mean, you used a key word there, and that is awareness. Both self-awareness and also awareness of those around us. And we've talked about that over previous weeks. There are a few really basic things. If you want to kind of just do a check-in with yourself or with anyone in your life, the check-in kind of has 3 sort of really basic things to check in on. And that, again, this is how the Lord created us. He knows that we need things not to be complicated or we're going to get lost. That's what happens to us. So the first one is, have there been significant changes in our sleeping patterns? either too much or too little. And has that lasted for a while, right? Not just a one-off or a two-off. Or if you can identify some other things that would interrupt your sleep, like a child waking you up 3 times through the night. That's obviously you know why. But if you're noticing significant changes in sleeping patterns, that's one cue. The second one is if you're noticing significant changes in eating patterns. Again, too much, too little. Lasting for more than just a one-off kind of thing, right? Or if you can't find some other identifiable reason for a loss of appetite, that type of thing. But that's an important one. And the third one is if you notice changes in your engagement with things that typically you would enjoy doing. That's some of the isolation stuff, some of the tendency to kind of pull back. If you're noticing changes in any of those things, it's just that's where the check-in starts, right? And then that's the time to figure out applying, again, really basic things to try to help get our brain to balance back out a little bit more. And I believe that these are things that the Lord, He built right into our system. And we skip over them most of the time because they're so simple, it makes them not easy, right? They're things that our brain automatically does, and we don't have to be intentional about it. As soon as we are intentional about them, they have the power to start shifting what's going on in our brain. And the first one, the most basic thing that we actually don't do very well, is breathing. In Genesis, we learn right from the beginning the importance of breath because God breathed life into the dust. This is how we were formed, and we're not breathing well most of the time. And there's a whole lot we could talk about in terms of what's going on when that happens, but it starts there. You want to quiet down some of the busyness. You want to slow things down. You want to figure out even how to get your racing heart to start slowing down. We have the capacity to do that just by changing how we breathe.
Right.
And that's not some, crazy out there thing. It's just literally forcing our brain to pay attention to breathing. The second thing is, in the language that's used in mental health circles, is grounding our brain. Our brain does its best work when it is as present focused as possible. But most of the time, especially with anxiety, we're constantly 10 to 12 steps ahead trying to figure out what's coming and be prepared for it. We can't really do a good job of that. Depression kind of gets us stuck a little bit here. Like, it's not about being stuck in the past, but it's kind of like trying to drive while only looking in the rearview mirror. Not an advisable way to drive.
Right.
We don't do good work when we're stuck there either. So how do we ground our brain? What's one tool we can use to help ground our brain? The Lord built it right into us. And that is forcing your brain to pay attention to anything through your senses, your 5 senses. You can't pay attention to those and not be present focused,
right.
not be grounded, right? But we don't pay attention to that most of the time. Everything you need, for all you coffee and tea drinkers, and I know we're 2 odd ones up here because neither of us drink those things, but everything you need to ground your brain is in a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. If you just force your brain to pay attention. That's the starting point. It doesn't magically fix everything.
Right.
But it starts to get things working in the way that they're designed to up in the brain to get us rebalanced.
Yeah.
And those are just some really simple things to help keep our experiences of anxiety and depression a little bit more in check.
Good. Well, our time is kind of gone. But I hope that you folks have found this to be helpful. As a church family, we found this to be helpful. I know you received a lot today, but it's a reminder too, even if you didn't pick up on all of the talk about the amygdala and all of these things, if you didn't pick up on all of that, just the sense that God sees us the way that we are. He designed us the way that we are. It's brokenness that sometimes allows us to go in an unhealthy direction, but the same God who created us can bring us back, right? And I just want to share with you like this verse from Psalm 73:26, and then we're going to have prayer. The team's going to lead us in a song of response. But in Psalm 73:26, I don't have a slide for this, but I'll just read it to you. My health may fail, the psalmist says. My health may fail, and my spirit may grow weak, but God remains the strength of my heart, and He is mine forever. I, again, want to thank you, Giselle. So helpful for us, not just in identifying and responding to people around us who may be struggling, but even as you kind of work through this, it's, I think, helpful when it comes to our own front door. And so we're trusting that the Lord will take and use it today and every day as we go from here. Let's have prayer.